out of coincidence, I was playing in a band in a club called the Agora, which was a big rock club in Cleveland back in the 70s. And I also worked in a record store at the time, so I knew those guys. I had heard their first 3 records at that point. I was familiar with them. I was playing in the basement. They had a bar down there called The Mistake, and Daryl and John were playing upstairs in the big room at the Agora. They were not really a big band yet, but they were kind of like, you knew of them. They had a few records out. And here they were coming to Cleveland to, play in a big club, probably half full. So I went upstairs and I met John after they finished their set. I saw their last couple songs, and I slipped him a tape. And that was that. And then I think probably 6 or 8 months later, I got a phone call from their manager, Tommy Mottola, who later on became quite an infamous music industry figure, who said, well, do you want to come up to New York and audition for Daryl and John's band because they need a guitarist? And of course said sure, and I jumped on a plane, and they sent me the new album that was coming out in a couple of weeks, with 5 titles circled. And I took my SG and put it on a plane with me, and we went up to New York City, and I auditioned for them. And it was the first time that I'd done anything, with a national level. I knew them, I knew they were really good. And when I heard that, what was then their 4th album, they had made another change. And Daryl and John were those kind of guys. They were always changing what they were doing. It was at SIR in New York City, a couple of doors down from Studio 54 on 54th Street. And it was a cattle call. So I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I had my guitar. I was going to New York. They said, show up here at 2:00. And there was like a hallway full of guitar players sitting around. And I thought, oh, I get it. All right, yeah, this is New York City. I'm probably not going to get this gig. So yeah, I auditioned, and it went really well. And I think what happened was they asked me to stay an extra night and then come back the next day and do it again. And then they hired me, yeah. Definitely covering the parts, if you're going to audition for somebody and you've got the record and there's some key signatures that you think are part of that song, learn those.
Were any of those songs that we now know as being...
Oh, yeah. It's funny, because I don't know if Sarah Smile was in the audition, right? But that was their first hit. And that was on that album. Gosh, I don't even know the rest of the songs at the moment. But anyhow, they gave me 5 songs to learn, and I learned them pretty good. And in those days, this was 1975. I think I just walked in the room and there was an amp, and I just plugged into the amp. I think it was a Super Reverb, which at that point I probably never even played through a Super Reverb. And with my SG, and we played. And I think, yeah, we did jam some. They were kind of, at that point they really were kind of branching out, and they were more experimental than you'd think. I guess from my perspective, so Daryl and John are super talented cats, man. And, I grew up in Cleveland playing all kinds of music. My dad was a guitar player. He would, push me into crazy gigs, Broadway shows coming to town. There's a book you got to be able to read. I was trying. He'd go, well, you're doing this one. And I'd go like, I can barely read. He'd go, sure you can. He would be like, do this. To mostly playing in blues bands and rock and roll bands, and mostly blues bands. And I go up to New York City and meet Daryl and John, who are these Philadelphia kind of tinged soul dudes that were kind of folky originally and then evolved into this thing. And then their new album was really stretched out. It kind of had all these elements, plus a couple of tablespoons of the Beatles somehow. And when I met them and we played together, they sang so good that it freaked me out. It was like, I've never worked with anybody that was that good. They were total pros. They were probably in their 20s at the time. They just had it all going on. And I think at that point they said to me, so here's the deal, man. We're going to England. We got a new record coming out. We got a new record company, and they're going to bring us to London. It was RCA Records. And we're going to do a show for the record label in all of Europe. It's a private party at Ronnie Scott's famous jazz room, really. And we also have a gig at a theater in London because apparently we have some fans there. And okay, and that was it. We had 2 gigs and 10 days to get ready to do 90 minutes. So, you know, some serious studying. I hole up in my hotel room all night, you know, learning songs, and then we'd rehearse for hours. Got on a plane, went to London. The first thing we did was we played at this new Victoria Theatre, which is a great London house, real theater. And it was like packed. And it was also packed with British rock stars. You know, like people would go like, we want to see these new bands. People would go see who's playing. And I remember their record company guys would like come into the dressing room before we'd go on and say like, Pete Townsend's here, you know, and they keep coming back with who's here. The guys from Steely Dan are in town, they're here. And, you know, they kept doing that. It was like, wow, this is really something. So anyhow, we went out and did this show and we killed it. It was you know, we had a good night. It's the first time I ever played with them live. The next day, there used to be, you know, the Melody Maker and the New Music Express and something else. They were kind of, you know, England was a music mecca, obviously. And that was like their Rolling Stone and Circus Magazine. Back in the day in America, there were 3 or 4 music rags, right? Rolling Stone was the biggie. But in Britain, Melody Maker, and, you know, they had about 3 or 4 of them. And the day after we played our show, Daryl and John were on the front page in giant photos, and England fell in love with them instantly. They were like, you know, it was like, wow. And for me, you know, I was like, oh, this is cool. So that's how it works, you know. And they booked us a tour. You know, it was like, yeah, well, good. We're coming back, and we're going to do 6 weeks in the UK. And everybody was excited about that. And we came back to New York, and I think there was a possibility of a tour on the books. Maybe we're going to do some colleges on the East Coast or something, which I was, of course, super excited about. And right about that time, the song Sarah Smile for them started to pop up on the radio. Ironically, out of Cleveland. There was a DJ in Cleveland. It wasn't their single. It was a black station in Cleveland started playing Sarah Smile. And I think some people said, well, you know, maybe we should put that one out as a single. And that was their first hit. So I just stepped into that situation just as it ramped up for them. Of course, it was their 4th album. So here's the deal. I never recorded with Daryl and John. I was in their touring band. And those guys were, at that point, they were very tight, 2 guys, great management. Had a producer named Christopher Bond, who did a couple of records when I was in their band. And Chris was a brilliant guitarist and arranger. And so that's who played the guitar on their records. It was their producer, Chris. And which was great, man. And although 40 years later, Guthrie Trapp is playing with John, who's now kind of doing his own stuff. And it's back to rootsy stuff. Because when I joined their band, and John and I were guitar players, and when we would sit down with guitars, John was this sort of folk guitar, Doc Watson, finger-picking, you know, freight train kind of stuff. But yet Hall & Oates were doing this Philly soul-tinged music. It was really interesting. But that was obviously his roots. And 40 years later, he's starting to do that music again on his own. Guthrie, my pal, who's an amazing guitar player, is out there playing with John. And he brings me this 6 CD package back on a trip. He comes over to the house, and he says, hey, John gave this to me to give to you. And I was like, oh, that's cool. and it's signed, and it says, "Todd, you played your ass off" on the front of it. And I thought, this is really neat, man. And I open it up, and there's a booklet and stories of the songs and how they made the records, and some of their first demos are there, and a little, bit about each track. And it's 6 CDs long or something. And on the end of disc 1 is 5 live tracks from the New Victoria Theatre from October 1975. And I'm like, oh, that's why John sent this over. And I was like, wow, man, that's the first gig I played with them. It's the first time I walked on stage with them. And it was sort of a neat full circle little deal there to happen. But, here's the cool thing about that story, is that I did have an intro, an in, kind of like you'll be able to get backstage and meet the guys. Other than that, I slipped John Oates a tape. We said hello, we shook hands, and they jumped on their bus or whatever and left. And usually you think, okay, the tape's going in the trash can on the way out the door, and, that was fun. And 6 months later, I got a phone call. So you never know what's going to happen. And ever since that day, that that just taught me a great lesson, really. Show up and play in the basement bar, even if it sucks. You got a tape, put it in people's pockets, put them in the mailbox, send them around. Actually, I had a message on my machine when we used to have answering machines, and it was about an audition it was garbled. I thought it said Bob Weir. Bob Weir, 5 p.m., studio instrumentals, stage 6, we'll see you there. And I thought, what is this? I have no idea who this is or why they're calling me. I thought it was Bob Weir. I called the number back and I said, what's the deal? And they said, it's Bob Welch. And it wasn't Bob himself, but the management office. And I said, oh, Bob Welch from Fleetwood Mac. I'm very familiar with Bob Welch and Fleetwood Mac. I'm a huge fan. I got all the records. I know Bob Welch very well. I know of him very well. So they said, yeah, we got you down for 5 o'clock tonight. And have you not talked to anybody yet? And I was like, no, this is the first I've heard of it. So it was a woman on the phone. She said, well, you better run out to the record store and pick up Bob just put out his first solo album. And of course, this is right after Fleetwood Mac exploded, with Lindsay and Stevie and their first record and, Christine and the new thing. So Bob's record's out, and I run up to the store and I get the record and I try and get a few things, and I run down to SIR with my SG. And I walk into the door, and Bob's standing there with a bass around his shoulder, and Mick Fleetwood's sitting behind a drum kit. And it was just the coolest thing in the world because we all kind of hit it off. And of course, I'd always been a fan of Mick Fleetwood and an admirer of his tenacity because I have the first record. It's in my collection. I've shedded Peter Green. I got Fleetwood Mac Blues Jam and Chicago records. I have Kiln House. I got Bare Trees. I have them all. And always a big admirer of the fact that Fleetwood and McVie and John McVie had this awesome rhythm section. They were kind of amazing shufflers and bluesmen. They're huge reverence to this form. And brought that to Fleetwood Mac and kept it going through all these trials and not quite making it. And then Peter Green quits, and then Bob Welch comes in, and then Christine McVie joins, and Danny Corwan and Jeremy. It's just, and then finally they put all that together. I remember when what was their first hit? Maybe it was it Don't Stop? I don't know, but it was a shuffle. They were like shuffling along, and I went, they're still shuffling, but it's like, it's a huge hit. That's cool. We jammed for a couple hours, and we just hit it off. And the three of us, I guess I was the first call. I mean, it was like maybe Mick. So Mick was managing Bob at that point. And I imagine the idea was, let me help you get a band together because you got a record out and you're going to tour. Why don't we look for a guitar player first? So I guess I was, one of the guitar players. And they hired me, and it struck up the beginning of a lifelong friendship, not only with Bob, but with Mick. Mick and I really kind of hit it off, probably because I was such a big fan, and I kind of, so we used to hang out a lot, just, jam in his basement and talk about stuff.
What do you remember about Cal Jam 2?
It was way too early in the morning, and we attempted to be wide awake way too early in the morning, and when I saw the film, I thought,
how many people were
boy,
there?
we sounded like we were a little over medicated. There was 250,000 people or something like that. It was, it wasn't Fleetwood Mac wasn't on the bill, but all kinds of bands were, and Bob was. And Mick was there, came with us, and so did Stevie Nicks came with us. And as a matter of fact, there's footage out there of one of the songs on YouTube, and Stevie's playing tambourine, and she, she shared my microphone with me for my background part, and she just appeared. I don't think I remember knowing she was there, and I remember her just kind of sneaking up, and all of a sudden I went, well, okay, I guess it's your mic now. He's extremely funny. He's physically a funny guy. Like, he could be an actor. He's like, I don't know how tall Mick is, probably 6'8". And, his expressions and his facial stuff. So he's a funny guy. And he's an amazing drummer, and he's, a huge music dude. Gosh, I don't know. I just somehow I had the opportunity to be in the right place at the right time. We were pretty good friends for a while. Like I said, he would call me and go, "Come on over." I go, we'd jam in his basement. We'd talk about stuff. At one point, he had this crazy idea that he wanted to go to Africa and make a record with African kids. And I think he said, I want to get a bunch of little cheap guitars and do open tuning and see if we can get like a whole bunch of these kids to play, and then get some drums. We were out of our minds at that point. It was a little late, let's say. And I said, well, look, I'll tune the guitars. So if you ever get this together, I'm in. And, a couple of years later, his assistant called me on the phone. Mick had moved to Australia, I think, at that point. She said, Mick asked me to call you. He has he's going to Africa. He has a record deal, and he's going to go make a record in Africa. He wants you to go with him. You have to go get some inoculations, 8 weeks. Let's, get ready. He wants you to go down to his locker and grab a few guitars to bring, maybe listen to some African music. You're going to go to Ghana, and he wants to do a Buddy Holly song, Not Fade Away, and a few very rough sketch of what we're going to do. And it was kind of like, Mick's a drummer, and he needs you to be sort of the music guy that could maybe talk notes and chords a little bit. We went to Accra, which is the capital city of Ghana. And it was extraordinary because somehow Mick had been advised to go there. There was maybe Senegal was a place, maybe Nigeria. And I think there was a musicologist professor somewhere along the line that had sat down with him and said, you should go to Ghana. And it's friendly. There's great music throughout their culture, and in Accra, it's not hard to find. And they found an old film studio. So this is crazy. By the way, right before we went, Mick brought in George Hawkins, who's a bass player, who I already knew George. George had played with Loggins and Messina and Kenny Loggins. And when I was with Hall & Oates, we did probably a good stretch of tour, Hall & Oates and Kenny Loggins on one bill. And we became buddies a little bit. Great, talented guy, super bass player, amazing singer, funniest guy in the music business, best hang there is. So right before I left, Mick's got George Hawkins to come. I'm like, great, now we got a bass player and a guitar player and a drummer. We're set. So we go to Ghana, and none of us know what we're really going to do. And Accra, at that point, this was 1980, was like a place that had been through different regimes. It was a British colonized place until 1959. After that, Russians came in and kind of ran Ghana. And after that, they just became independent. And there was kind of like, it was super, there wasn't a whole lot there, man. There wasn't like a lot of running water or sewers, electricity in most of the city. We're in the city, in the capital, in Accra. And so anyhow, Mick's arranged for us to go into this Ghana Films, which was built in the 50s. They made a tourist film, apparently, at some point. And that's really all they ever did. And it was a great big warehouse, kind of like this, a soundstage, with nothing in it. And so that was our room, and we brought everything. We brought recording gear. We brought amps and guitars. Hell, we brought food. I mean, we were reading advisements that was like, do whatever you do, don't drink any of the palm wine, and don't eat any dairy, and you'll get terribly sick. Anyhow, we brought everything we needed. We had a great sound stage, and then there was a guy there. This is so crazy to talk about it. There was a guy named Faisal Helwani, who was a Lebanese guy. Had a couple of gold teeth, wore a captain's hat, and somehow drove around Accra in a Buick Electra 225 with bad shocks. And Faisal had organized a musicians union in Ghana when he heard that Fleetwood Mac was coming. And he was our guy. He was our connection to the local people. And he would bring bands in. And the first couple of weeks, we just went around and listened to artists and bands. We'd go to people's backyards. There were shanties and things like that. It was like a shanty town, Accra. And everything completely blew us away. It was like, to me, it was like, if you went to music heaven to explore a new world of music that you never heard or knew existed, this would be it. It just was unbelievably great. And in a place where almost everybody had almost nothing. There was this one band, and they had a guitar player who had like some kind of old Silvertone guitar with strings about that high off the neck. And he played them beautifully. And he had these singers, and the singers had skirts on with beads. And when they moved a certain way, the beads would be a part of the thing. And there was always a couple of drummers, meaning maybe somebody who played like a gourd with beads that he knocked. Someone else who played a little gonji drum, and it all fit together. Anyhow, we heard all these bands, and then we brought some of them in, and sometimes we just recorded them and overdubbed, and sometimes we played together, and some of it was successful and some of it wasn't. No one ever saw a pair of headphones before. And you know what I mean? Like, we'd occasionally go like, that choir was amazing. Let's see if we can get them to put some ahs. Or, I got this part I want them to sing on my song. And it goes like this. And you get them in and play them and put headphones on, and it was like they couldn't figure it out. It was like they never had headphones. They never sang to a tape. Some of it worked, and some of it, was just we tried and it wasn't going to work. It's really a good album. It's called The Visitor, Mick Fleetwood, The Visitor. There was even a film made out of it. It was on PBS when it came out.
Is it on YouTube somewhere?
Probably. Yeah, there are clips. Yeah. There's a clip of a children's drum troupe that'll just blow your mind if you watch it. It's because they're amazing. And it was all just crazy. There's this one band that was, the Ghanaian music, they call it high life. There's this influence of like almost a little bit of Spanish classical or lute music, what you would think is reggae music, a little bit of James Brown, it was like, but the rhythmic complexity of what was going on. I mean, George and I, Hawkins, we're trying to figure out how to play some of the instruments and how they put together those rhythms. And we were like, the white guys, like, well, the accent isn't on the 2 or the 4, it's like, and they would have these different drums and different instruments and bells, like one guy who just played cowbells. And none of them would play in the same spot at the same time. And it all fell together in this thing that would just blow you away, how beautiful it is. And, oh man, I don't know. That was in 1980. And I often wonder, what it's like there now, And by the time we left, I remember there was a guy who came in, he had an instrument called a gonji, and he made me one. And I took it home, and of course it sort of fell apart after some years. It dried up and cracked. And so what I'm talking about is these guys made drums out of tree trunks and deer skins stretched over the head. And if they could find wire or something to tie the skins together with, that was a big deal. And this guy made me a gonji out of a gourd with a skin stretched across the top and a horsetail, so one big thick strand of horsetail, and a stick. And a bow that was just a curved bow about that wide, and another horsetail. And this dude came in and he played the blues on this. I remember we cut Rattlesnake Shake, a Fleetwood Mac song. It's on the record. And this guy came in and he was sitting there playing, and I was like, we have to get him to play his thing on this track because he's awesome. He's amazing. And he couldn't quite get the headphones. And I think then we tried to play it through a speaker while he played, and it just didn't quite come together. And I think those guys were of the mind that, hey, if it doesn't come together quickly, bail. We move on. And I was like, no, don't bail. If it takes 12 hours, then let's do it. That's me. Anyways, the guy made me one of those instruments, and I took it home, and it was that kind of thing. Those are the instrumentation. One day we're in the studio, and I remember I was putting new strings on my guitar. And we had this band came in, and I cut the strings off my guitar with a pair of cutters, and this guy came up to me and goes, please, don't cut the strings. I would love to have them. And he showed me his guitar. And he had strings tied in knots above the nut. Like when they break, that's what he would do. And of course, once I got back home, I sent him a box of strings, like 24 sets of guitar strings or something.
Some perspective.
Yeah. Oh, not only that, just people who had so little, but they were so happy. It was such a happy place to be in. And friendly and warm. But, it's different. It was a real education for a about 22-year-old or however old I was in 1980 to go to a country like that and, spend 6 weeks And we stayed in a diplomatic community. It's where all the embassies were. So we, but everyone else lived in shanties. People would go to wells and get big buckets of water. Kids would, you see, carrying around on their heads to take home and wash. You'd see people bathing, just sitting in front of their place. Water to cook with. It was that kind of place. And it was something to realize how much we have and how little some others have, but what a great time they're having with life in making this music. Everybody sang or danced or did something. Another thing I had, there was this little thing, George and I got them. There were small gourds about the size of, like, between a golf ball and a little smaller than a tennis ball, a gourd. And they would dry it and hollow it and then take some seeds and put them inside and put a little stick in there and a string, too, and tie them together. And you'd hold one and throw the other one over your hand. The string was just the right length so it would, it would shake, and then you'd throw it and it would go and then go back. So it was like, and you had to catch it with the rest of your fingers against the other one. And it was like, that was move one. And we spent the whole time sick, trying to get that down. Somebody showed it to us and made them for us. And then one day this little kid goes, and the musicians would laugh. They go, oh, those are like kids' toys. And sure enough, one of these kid drummers, had one in each hand. And he was just screaming on them and then bouncing it off walls and, anyways. So yeah, Christine McVie, we were very close for a period. And she asked me to write an album with her, me, Sharp, from Cleveland. One of my heroes. I used to listen to Christine McVie with headphones on my dad's stereo, when I was 17, and probably fantasize about working with somebody like Christine McVie. And 10 years later-ish, we had become friends through Bob and Mick. And, Bob, we worked with Fleetwood Mac. We kind of opened all the big stadium shows. We were always playing with that band. And so Chris and I got to know each other. She would invite my wife and I over to the house. We would hang out. She was a very friendly, social type in that way. I'm trying to figure out how to write songs and making tapes and stuff, and I played her some of my demos, and she loved one of my songs and said, well, can I come sing backgrounds on that? And I was like, on my demo? You were gonna, okay. Anyhow, this kind of continued, and she invited me to write her album and help her put a band together, because she didn't feel quite solo, like a solo artist. She wanted a pal to do it with, and I got to be that, so that was amazing. So we recorded an album in Switzerland. We got a great band together. We had written these songs. We went to Montreux, Switzerland. Russ Titelman produced it. It was George Hawkins, myself. And we didn't have a drummer. We're trying to figure that out. Russ suggested Steve Ferrone, who at the time had just come out of the Average White Band. And I thought, well, Steve Ferrone, I know, he might be a little slick for this, a little polished. But okay, and Russ said, yeah, but you got to try him. I'll get him here, because Steve was in New York that time. Sure enough, Steve came in. We went into a studio and played 2 songs, and that was that. So Steve was the guy who then, later on, Steve's played with everybody and was with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers forever. We just breezed through most of the record because Chris and I had really done our homework, and we had demos. So we're listening to stuff, and we're in Europe, and Chris said, yeah, well, let's see if we can get Eric to play on something. And, I, of course, went, Clapton? You know Clapton? She said, oh, yeah, of course. Because the Brits are like this. It's almost like they're all of the same era, the same sort of neighborhood even, maybe. Probably that's not really true, but it seems that way to a guy like me. So she said, yeah, of course I know Eric from... And when you think about it, so, yeah, John was in John Mayall's Blues Breakers with Eric, and Chris probably knows Eric, or she was in Chicken Shack, which was a blues band. And the same thing happened with Steve Winwood. She said, well, I'd love to get Steve to do something. And I, of course, went, I'm thinking, like, which Steve? You mean? She said, well, Winwood. We went to art school together. Of course you did. So anyhow, we're going to London to do some overdubs. Ray Cooper was another who came in, percussionist, brilliant percussionist. Eric Clapton's going to come in and listen to the record and pick something to play on. Steve Winwood, we went to Steve's house for a week, and he just hung out with us and the record for a little while. It was amazing. For me, it was like, oh, these are my people I grew up to listening to and really admire, and even better because they were not assholes, none of them. Eric, I remember we're in the studio. I went to get a bagel or something and a cup of tea. And there's a window in front of Olympic Studios, legendary Olympic Studios in London. Apparently Eric had said, I like Studio C or whatever it is. I like the little room, which is across the hall from the big room, which is where, like, Beggar's Banquet was made, and Who's Next, and Led Zeppelin 2, I don't know what records, but all of it. Legendary records are made in that room that we all grew up on. Eric likes the little room. I'm hanging out, and I see this guy start coming up the steps through the glass window with 2 gig bags and a tweed twin, I think. And he's walking up the stairs carrying them. And I go, Jesus Christ, that's Eric Clapton. And I go out the door, I go, hey, can I give you a hand? And so, I helped him pump his gear in. And I thought, I would have thought he'd had some cartage. Anyhow, he came in, he sat down, he was a cool guy. He was, it was nice. And he listened to the record, and he picked a track. He did about 3 passes, and we recorded all of them. And Russ said, I think we got it, and then he left. But in that process, he was listening to the record, and he would now and then turn around to me and kind of go like, he gave me the wink a few times. He just gave me the nod a couple of times. I went like, yeah. And at one point he said, well, that doesn't, you got that one covered. You play great. And I said, I stole most of it from you. And he said, well, I stole most of it from Freddie King and Buddy Guy, and, we started to talk a little bit about that. One regret I will always have is that I'm an idiot, because we were talking guitars, like guitar players will do. He had his Blackie Strat. I have a picture of me and him and Blackie. And he said, well, you got a Strat on that one. And I said, yeah, it was stolen, because I had this really cool Strat. And someone broke in the studio in Montreux where we were recording and stole my Strat. That's all they took. There were tons of great microphones and all kinds of stuff, but my Stratocaster disappeared. I said, I just lost it because it was stolen, and I had just bought a new Fender Squier in London for, £100, which was pretty good. And he said, well, it just so happens I'm kind of in the loop with the Stratocaster world. Let me know if I can help you find one. And I thought, he doesn't need to. He doesn't really mean that.
Just being nice.
Yeah. So I think he gave me his number, and I didn't call him. I wished now that, I would have taken him up on that one. He's just a super nice guy. And he played really great guitar, and of course he did. And packed his gear, and you know, and I helped him load his amp back in the car.
Was he particular about anything while he was recording, like mic placement, anything that you remember?
Not that I remember. I think he brought a guitar and an amp that he liked, 2 guitars, and he sat in the control room with us. And I think at one point I got up and left when he was in the middle of, or before he did take 2. I just felt like, you know, dude doesn't need a drooling guitar player sitting around going, what's he going to do next? You know, I should probably go, you know, give him some space to do his thing. But no, there wasn't a whole lot of fuss. And, you know, when you work with people in that caliber, he knew the room he liked to work in. He probably did know where he wanted his amp. And there was a great engineer there. You know, those people, everyone had their shit together. Interesting sidebar there is when I did get up and leave, I go into the lounge, and James Taylor's there. And we talked and hung out for, 45 minutes. And so Russ had produced a James Taylor record. Probably said, hey, you're in town. Well, we're going to be at Olympic. If you're around, come stop in. So we're recording with Eric Clapton in the next room, and James is, having a bagel and cream cheese and a cup of tea, and we hung out for a while. Again, one of my all-time heroes, super nice guy, told me about his adventures in Europe and that he loves to travel. And it was like, what are you doing? I'm nothing. I'm just traveling around. I was in Switzerland for a little while. I like to travel. That's kind of where I get ideas from. And, he was funny. It was a little period. I just kind of came back from that record and went, I got to write an album with Christine McVie, hang with Eric Clapton, play with Steve Winwood, had dinner with him and his wife every night at his home for a week, meet James Taylor, Ray Cooper, who came in to play percussion. Brilliant, super nice guy, and great. He's so good that you can't watch him play because he's real animated. Like when he plays a tambourine, it's like you can't not watch him, but you kind of need to listen to make sure that we're like, there wasn't a beat off there, and to make sure you're getting it right. There was a moment I remember with Steve where he kind of invited me into his library. He had this great old house on a big piece of property. And he had this old library with a big leather couch and a Macintosh stereo or whatever it was, I don't know, but a great stereo. And he just put on the Ray Charles live record, side 2 or something. And we just sat there and listened to it. And at one point I kind of went, man, I'm hanging out with Steve Winwood listening to Ray Charles. This is very good right here. And it's funny because when I was sitting next to Steve Winwood and listening to Ray Charles, it occurred to me that Steve Winwood revered Ray Charles. And why it was like, oh, well, this is who we always listen to. You can hear it. It's kind of, you hear that emulation. That was his muse as a singer, I think. But what a great guy and a brilliant musician. He's very much his own musician. He sang on a song Chris and I wrote. He laid in a few little synth parts that was like, brilliant session musician would, the kind of stuff that great session guys do. Let me tweak this synth part right here. How's that for the intro, And you just go like, yeah, yeah.
That's all because you took the time to pick up a guitar and learn a few chords. And we don't think about where that's going to take us in life, but that's freaking beautiful.
Yeah, man, it really is. And also, I don't think she looked at it as like, hey, I'm going to offer you this great opportunity. She just was like, can we hang? Because I need a partner here. And but after, like I said, when she passed away, I wrote a little thing and posted it about, growing up, listening to Christine, and then working with her. And of course, after having some perspective on all that, what a generous and amazing thing that is to have someone like that help you, like John Oates did when he actually kept the tape. There's that expression, some people climb up the ladder of success and pull it up behind them, and other people drop it down and go, hey, come on up. So, it's pretty amazing when you have the opportunity from some of those folks to invite you on up. So I had been playing around town a little bit with David Crosby. And we played a gig somewhere, and I ran into an old friend of mine, Carmine Rojas, was out there in the audience, and he came back. And so here he is. Hey, Carmine, what's going on? He goes, we say hello. I give him my number. We exchange numbers. And sometime later, not too long later, he called me and said, you want to go on tour with Rod? I'm his band leader, and we need a guitar player. You'd be perfect for it. And I said, yeah, sure, of course. He says, okay, so, we're here. It's a year-long tour. You got to learn about 40 songs, which I already know about 18 of them. We all do. And it's Rod Stewart. Again, headphones in my father's house at KLH, listening to Jeff Beck Truth and Faces and Rod Stewart's Gasoline Alley. And, I know Rod Stewart pretty well. So I said, Carmine, so, okay. He said, rehearsal starts on the 26th. We got 10 days, and then we're going to South America. Then we're going to do a 6 months U.S. tour, and then we're going to the Far East. And, okay. So, well, when do I audition? And he said, well, you don't. You're in the band. I'm the band leader. And we're going to get you and Steve Ferris from Mr. Mister, you two guys. Okay, and I knew Steve. We used to hang out a little bit in L.A. I guess Mr. Mister must have broke up at that point. Anyways, so I said, well, no audition. What if Rod doesn't like me? He said, well, he'll fire you. And I was like, okay. So it was kind of like, so try not to get fired. All right. Anyhow, I walked into the rehearsal room one day and we started playing. We rehearsed just the band for probably 8 days, ran a ton of tunes. And Rod came on the day before the last rehearsal, and I met him, and he was cool. And he just kind of walked up to me and said, yeah, I like the way you do the shuffle. We're going to do some of that. I go, okay, cool. All right, I guess he likes me. And then he said, do you sing? And I said, yeah. And he said, can you sing the harmonies with me on? And he threw a couple songs out. And I, of course, said, oh, yeah, okay. Say yes. And the next day he came back to rehearsal, and he didn't sing again. There was no singing from Rod at rehearsals. So, okay, we do the first show. It's in Brazil, in a soccer stadium. There's 90,000 people there. And we're in this funky, gigantic soccer cement thing, shower stall, dressing room kind of thing. And I said, hey, do you want to go over, some guys have all the luck before we go up there? And, we're like putting our shirts on and stuff. And he looks at me and he goes, nah, we'll just do it on stage. He goes, just watch me. Okay. And that's kind of how playing with Rod was. He was, he approved, almost all the conversation about the musicality of the show and whatever was like, Yeah, well, you're good. You got this. So you know what to do. And I did know what to do. It's like you're not going to play Maggie May without playing the exact intro, you know, because you'd be a total asshole to think you could do that. Or any of the other songs that have the big signatures. But Rod was not terribly hung up on the rest of it. And you never knew what was going to happen on stage with Rod. It would be like, you know, he might throw you a solo or might not. He might throw you a solo and then decide he should go change his clothes. And you'd be like looking at, you know, be like, now what? Carmine would look back and you go like, vamp. All right. Rod would start a song sometimes and then stop it. You know, every once in a while. He's that kind of performer. He didn't, you know, he was like, I don't want to do this one. Stop. Hey guys, stop. You know, with the 20,000 people out there. Playing with Rod was always a party. And he was and is, he is one of the best singers in the world. He just knows how to sing. Again, you know, I didn't realize that Rod sang like Sam Cooke until I played in his band and we started to play Sam Cooke songs. And that would be the thing, you know, it'd be like you'd have a set list, but he might just go, hey, let's do Having a Party, you know, or you know, and you'd be playing Sam Cooke tunes and then you'd hear him sing and go, oh my God, that's Sam Cooke, isn't it? I never put that together. I'm not that smart. But yeah, he was always, without him saying it, you got the message that what we do here is, this is a show. I don't really care if you're perfectly in tune. I don't give a shit which guitar you play or, you know, whether you think your sound is cool. And of course, is my sound cool? Like all of us, you know. I would come to sound check and work on like, I got to get that thing on Stay With Me a little gringier, you know. Rod never said anything to me like, hey, you got to get that sound on Stay With Me. Rod was more like, when we come up on stage, we're having a show. The audience came to see a show, we're going to give them one. You make some mistakes, I don't give a shit. You know, you play a solo, go up to the front of the stage. As soon as I got in his band, he would be like that. He'd look at me, like, oh. And then he would swing the mic stand when it was time. He'd let you know because you'd feel a mic stand come right about here and be like, okay, I'm going back. But, and you know, he built this thing, man. He built this thing. Everywhere we went, really in the whole world, was sold out, packed. And as soon as we'd go on stage, people would go crazy. And, you know, women would throw underwear. And, you know, it was that kind of thing. It was like, this is rock and roll. And this is a different kind of rock and roll. I dig this rock and roll, you know. And
those clips of the faces of them live, there's so much magic to everything happening. Like
yeah.
The energy between them that they're, you know, sharing, it's just like otherworldly. I love watching that stuff.
And, you know, again, we're Americans, and we're talking about the Brits. Yeah, Ian McLagan was in Rod's band for not all the time, but for some of the time that I was there. And, you know, playing with Rod was like, I was there for about 6 years, except for a few spots. I guess I wasn't there because I didn't get the call, but they were doing that or whatever. And different people would come in and out. Ian came in at one point, who I had worked with some in L.A. Original Faces, Small Faces, Itchy-Coo Park. I'm working with Ian McLagan, coolest guy in the world. We were just great buddies on the road, you know. And, you know, Kenny Jones, who then was with The Who and other stuff. I never really got to know Ronnie Lane, who was brilliant. Ronnie Wood came to one of our shows, and he was just a blast. We hung out, loads of laughs in the dressing room. We played in Dublin, and I think he was living there, or close to it at the time. And, okay, here's a funny moment. Rod might not appreciate this, but, he'll probably never see this. I don't know. So Ronnie's going to come play a song with us. And we're all, at that point, on in-ears. We were traveling with a stage. The whole thing was like tons of trucks and staging. All our amps are not on stage. There's no amps on stage. It's a 2-tier stage, and Rod usually is up on the top in the middle. The band's on the next tier. Ronnie's guy comes and sets up a Marshall up next to me, and he's going to come play a song with us. Cool. The song is Sweet Little Rock and Roller. I usually do the intro on that one, and of course I'm like, you got it. So we're about to play Sweet Little Rock and Roller, and of course Woody's got the cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and no one smoke, and you definitely don't smoke around Rod. And Rod leans down, and he says, he's just about to we're about to start it, and Rod says, now don't play it too slow, Woody. And right away it's like, this is the kind of shit that breaks bands up. This is probably what it was. You know what I mean? Like why there isn't a Faces anymore. And Woody goes, and he just covers his head in smoke. It's the first thing he does. And then he turns around and goes, and that song is like, right? It's the singer. It was going like, speed it up. He starts it like half as fast as it's supposed to be, and with a cloud of smoke, and it was just like, it was so cool. It was like cool to see Ronnie Wood and Rod Stewart have a little moment that, whether it was meant well jokingly or just pissed Rod off, probably, but it was pretty cool to be just stand there next to that, like that. Okay. And Woody was so fat, man. As soon as he started to play, you just went, oh, that's it. That's how that works. That's Chuck Berry reimagined by, a British guy who's a generation ahead of me or something. Not everybody can do that. And the groove and the pocket was just instantly like, yes, my brother, that is how that's done, isn't it? Yeah, I thank you, And here's a great story, too. One night, we were playing in Vancouver, Canada. And, at that point with Rod, it's big-time rock and roll, man. We have a private jet. We're flying back to L.A. from Vancouver because we can go home after the show. And a little part of this is when I moved to L.A., one of the people I met right after I joined Bob Welch's band, like I'm 2 weeks in, and I'm in, and I'm, and I get a phone call from John Baldry. I don't know if you ever, Long John Baldry was a British blues guy. And when I was still working in a record store in Cleveland, he had a record, I can't remember the title of the album. It got big airplay in Cleveland. There was a track on it that was deep. And it was some of those guys like Mickey Waller on drums. And I don't remember who played in his band. I saw them play live. They came to town, and they were great. British blues guys. And Long John Baldry was a very tall guy, had a cane, kind of a deep voice. Anyhow, he calls me out of the blue. Says, I saw you play with Hall & Oates a few years ago at the New Victoria Theater. And I just looked you up from the Musicians Union, and I need a guitar player. I wonder if you might be interested. And I'm familiar with him, and I go down and meet him, and we had lunch together. And I said, man, I'd really appreciate it, but I'm in with Bob Welch. I'm just doing this, and I couldn't back out of it if I wanted to at this point. And that was that. And I don't know, 20-some years later, we're playing in Vancouver, and after the show, John Baldry comes back in the dressing room to say hello. And we had a couple of words, and he and Rod are old friends. All the English guys, they all are friends. It's not like they don't know each other. They all know each other. And we're on the jet on the way home after the show, and Rod walks out of his private back room suite. He's got a VHS tape in his hand, and he sits down next to me at a table, and he says, man, I just watched this tape. It's Muddy Waters at Newport, 1964 or something. He goes, when I was like 17, John Baldry gave me this album. He had the album, and he gave it to me, and he said I was to have it. It was mine for 2 weeks, and I'd take care of it and not leave it in the sun or scratch it, and put it back in the jacket in the right way, and And then I had to give it back to him because it then went to Jeff. And I said, Beck? He goes, yeah. We grew up together. And I was like, wow. It was the only album in the country. John had it. And he was our mentor. And then it went to Ronnie. And I said, Wood? And he goes, no, Ronnie Lane. Then it went to Ronnie Wood. And so on. And then it went to, and he started, he said, this is how it used to be in England. There was only a couple of guys, and they brought it. John Baldry, Alexis Corner, John Mayall. They all were lit up by American blues music. Some of these artists were in the early 60s touring in England. And the Brits got it. And of course, then they brought it back to us with Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page and Peter Green and Jeff Beck and started talking about, it's B.B. King, it's Albert King, it's Freddie, it's Mississippi John Hurt, it's whoever it is, which is an interesting thing when you really look at that picture. But anyhow, that was to me just like, it blew me away, like, wow, what a story. He said, so the same album went to those guys. Yeah, I've heard of those guys. Jeff Beck, Ronnie Lane, Ronnie Wood, Rod Stewart, and John Baldry was the guy who made sure they all had that record for a little while. I would say this, Rod Stewart is an authentic motherfucking rock star. He doesn't put it on. It's not like, he just is that person. And he's a pretty good guy. He's actually a funny man. He's kind of a prankster. He's a good laugher, which is a very important thing in this world. I don't know. I've seen him around his kids. He's just a normal cat. He loves his kids. He's a huge soccer fan. I think he actually could have been a pro soccer player at some point and decided, no, obviously he had a better idea to stick with Jeff Beck Group or whatever band it was. I don't know, man. Rod's a cool guy. He does his own thing, and the way he does it, he's very original. And he's a rock star.
How did you get the David Crosby gig?
I had met David playing with a couple other guys, and he, I think, had just finished a solo record, which probably Steve Lukather played all the guitar on, or the other electric guitar. I don't know. It was at a rehearsal alley, rehearsal studios. David was a cool guy. At that point, David had just, he was a sober man, and he'd kind of come out of the crazy a little bit, or a lot. He had a solo record, and I was impressed with his, let's face it, probably one of the first records I ever bought in my life was Turn, 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 I guess. I remember watching watching the label, the 45. Crosby was in the Byrds, man, and then did a lot of great stuff, and then was in Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and he was not, you know, an egotistical jerk or anything like that. He was a really great rhythm guitar player, which you know, like you, I don't know, you just wouldn't expect it. I thought it was acoustic guitar, you know. But he had an electric guitar and he played really good rhythm. And he was a great singer. But he had a very interesting voice when it's just him. Of course, we've heard just David sing on some of the Crosby, Stills, Nash songs and things like that. But he was a blender in that thing. And Crosby, first of all, he was so accurate. You know, like he'd hit a note and it was just like I'm not really a singer, but I sing. And I can sing in tune, but I can't hit a note. If you say hit a G, I'll go, you know, just to go G and be right on it. This is kind of a stupid example, but his singing was, he had a really pure voice. I'm lucky, I'm blessed to have had a few moments to work with these kind of people. And, you know, like to work with David just long, and I only played 2 or 3 gigs with him. And we started to rehearse, and I left. But, you know, he was really a brilliantly talented guy, and just to see him on his own in that format and, like, want a band around him. No, he was pretty easygoing. And we hadn't dug in right yet to, like, we got to do 90 minutes, and here's the show. So I need you to learn all these 14 songs, and then this, and we're going to do a couple of these. That's it. Just the timing for me was, you know, I had made a phone call to him one night and said, I just got this offer to join Rod Stewart's band. It's a 13-month-long tour, and you know, I got 3 kids. I would hate to bail on you at this point, but like, and he kind of, there was this long pause on the other end of the phone, and Crosby was, you know, Crosby's Crosby. He's a hippie. He said, yeah, man. It was one of those, yeah, I get it, man. If I was you, I'd take that gig. You know, I'd like to have you along, but, you know, go ahead. You should do it. You know.
That says a lot.
You have my blessing. And then he got Danny Dugmore to come, you know. I wouldn't say take my place, because Dugmore doesn't need to take the place of a guy like me. But anyhow, Dugmore came in and did the tour.
That was either the best David Crosby impersonation I've ever heard, or it was the best
Dennis Hopper.
It was either the best Dennis Hopper.
Well, they were probably sort of similar backgrounds. Yeah. You know, a similar era for sure. Yeah. Bruton was my best friend from the time I met him to when he died. He was sort of this unique ball of energy that had this Texas part of his character and his music mixed in with a lot of other things. You know, from, you know, blues guitar to, he was almost a straight country player, but he wasn't at all. He had that, it's like Tex-Mex food, but it's Tex blues or it's Tex rock and roll or something. And Bruton was a very unique kind of guitarist. Lots of fun. I think it was after the Africa record with Fleetwood, George Hawkins brought me into this band. We were all LA guys at the time, in the 80s, early 80s. And it was myself, Hawkins, Stephen Bruton, Tom Canning, brilliant keyboard player, musician, used to play with Al Jarreau, and Trissom Bowden was the drummer. Triss had come from Kenny Loggins later on joined Chicago, and he's still in Chicago, or not anymore, but was in Chicago forever. And we were a band that was, we got together and rehearsed once at Stephen's house. That's the day I met him. And the idea was everybody brings 4 songs, and this is the only time we're ever going to rehearse, and we're not going to record an album or try and get a record deal. Our mission in life is to play at Tranca's Bar on Thursday nights. Everybody was, Stephen was working with Chris Christopherson. George always had a gig with somebody. I think at the time it was Al Jarreau. Canning was with Jarreau. Tris was with Kenny Loggins. I was probably without a gig for a while. But, that was the deal. We're just going to play in a bar and have fun. And we did. We played Thursday nights at Tranca's, and it was a blast. Tranca's Bar in Malibu was just way up there on the beach. It was a, wide open, early 80s. We were all out of our minds. And the people that would come in and, either sit in or join the band once in a while for a week, Richard Manuel from the band, just played with us for like 2 weeks. It was like, fuck. Amazing musician, sweet man. Gary Busey, Mick Fleetwood, whoever, anybody who was up there in Malibu would wander in. Christopherson. So it was a blast. And that's how I met Stephen. And one of the coolest things forever about Stephen, as soon as we met, it wasn't competitive. Let's see who can outshoot the other guy. It was just an instantaneous friendship and mutual admiration. And we played in a bar once a week. That's what we did. And then we worked together on other things here and there, including Christine McVie. When we went on the road, we thought we needed another guitarist, and I said, why don't we get Stephen to come along? And so he came on the road with us. And then at that point, he had been writing songs. He had great songs with the Lucky Dogs back then. But he became like a songwriter to be admired. And his guitar playing continued to evolve. And he was really his own kind of artist in his own way, you gotta, those kind of people are my heroes that persevere, stay with it. And, I got into this other stuff 20 some years ago with amps and whatever. Stephen, as soon as I moved here, he was like, He said, I need to introduce you to Delbert McClinton and Gary Nicholson, because you should be playing with Delbert. And I did play with Delbert for about 5 years when I moved to town. Because of Stephen, he was like, you got to keep playing, and you need to be in this band. And that was a fun 5 years. That was pretty amazing. That's the best band I've ever been in. I mean, I've been in a lot of good bands with great musicians, and but after 5 years with Delbert, playing, once you get 150 shows in with the same guys in a bar, it becomes like you all know how to speak your own language without even saying anything. And we made a couple records together with Delbert. I made a record with that band. It was just the easiest thing to do in the world. We cut the record in 3 days. I spent another 3 weeks doing some overdubs and trying to get a singer in here or there or whatever. And it was a great experience. It's a testimony to understanding that chemistry with musicians to where you actually know how to speak the same language. That to me has always been my favorite thing. my greatest aspiration as a musician was just ever to be in a great band. You know, I've made a couple of solo records. I never really wanted to be a solo artist, but I've made a few records. I really just wanted to be in Little Feat or something, you know, like a really good band. That's what I want to be. And I guess the closest I've ever been able to come to that was when I was in Delbert's band. And it was Delbert's thing, of course, but the band itself had that kind of family thing going on.